Hi everyone. As you may have heard in the recording of my most recent class, the one on today on the September 29th, Monday, I'm going to be away on a trip for a little less than 2 weeks in Europe and Canada. And so my return date is the 11th, which means I'll be back to doing classes on the 13th, Tuesday the 13th. The 6th, which is the week before, I won't be doing a live class. Instead, I'm posting a class that I did at the end of last year, mid-December. And the reason is that you will see somewhere around the third of the way mark, even though the first third is pretty good, it's talking about some patterns in Nancy Pelosi's chart that are always interesting astrology when it's presented in the class. But around a third of the way, you will see an extensive discussion of out of bounds patterns. These are planets that are either further north than the sun's solstice point or further south of the sun's solstice point, meaning winter and summer. And so this is called declination in astrology. When such planets are in those places out of bounds, they gain tremendous intensity, and you will see that you can look back at prior periods, most notably the Second World War. And what's important about this is that we're in them again. And you see the adage that you often hear, history may not repeat itself, but it certainly rhymes. So I encourage you to take a look, because these are not only important patterns when you see them in world conditions, perhaps that's the most important, but also in any individual's chart. If these out of bounds patterns happen, they point to likewise really important periods in their lives. Enjoy. The current positions right now of the planets, and so you can see the moon is super late in Gemini and it's about to enter Cancer, but it's not going to do that until about 11:22 or so. Right now it's near the very end of Gemini, and so it's a void, of course, because it can't make any angles to any planets. The last one that it made was to Neptune here in a square a few hours ago. Now it's late in the sign and it's about to switch signs, which it does, into Cancer in about 15 plus minutes. And this also sort of links to the topic that I posted on the channel yesterday around the fact that there was a full moon in the 1 a.m. range Pacific, but 4 a.m. in the east, in the 23, almost 24 degrees Gemini Sagittarius. And these full moons tend to heighten the energy and can be definite sources of triggers. So if you have a planet in this region of Gemini Sagittarius or of Virgo Pisces, then this full moon can become a trigger to something. And so by way of illustration, you may have heard about Nancy Pelosi and her hip injury. She was in Luxembourg, and she fell down the stairs and had to be airlifted to Germany to get an immediate operation on her hip because she broke her hip. And so now, before I show the patterns in her chart, I will say this right away, which is that it relates to the Pluto-Saturn square that she has at birth. It's very tight. You can see Saturn at 0:45 minutes of Taurus and Pluto at 0:40 minutes of Leo. A very tight square in the chart. But before I explain this chart, I will tell you that Saturn-Pluto can be quite harsh. It's an energy of something difficult that is happening that requires reconstruction, some kind of destruction, reconstruction of something. And even if you say the final result can be great, because once you get to the other side of it, the situation can be renewed, and that's great. But in the middle and at the time of the event, it definitely isn't a lot of fun. And I don't know if you remember from prior classes, I had talked about how in my own life, I have a Pluto moon square in my chart. And back at the end of 23, in December, we had an event that related to the plumbing situation in the house, and it was quite an upheaval. That month was really difficult because, without getting into a long story, it needed to be fixed, and that there was an overflow, there was a flood, it required repair in the basement, and then it led to a really big bill as well. Now, this was something that we knew needed to happen at some point, but unfortunately we were waiting, we didn't do anything, so then it happened. It happened concurrent with Saturn in very early Pisces. You can see it here, triggering my Moon-Pluto square. Now, plumbing and Pluto go hand in hand. That's Pluto's connection to Scorpio as a co-ruler and as an underworld planet. Plumbing, in fact, seems to signal that, including all questions of waste matter and all that kind of stuff. It's also Plutonian. But Saturn running into that, signals potential trouble. And the very interesting thing here is that this is the natal chart over here. And you can already just say, well, Moon is always a home planet through its association to Cancer as the natural fourth sign of the home. Although in this chart, it's the fifth in the natal chart. But nevertheless, there's a Pluto-Moon connection that you could say it's enough to reflect the pattern. But if you look at the chart for where I live, my relocation chart, you get even more information because you notice that the Saturn itself in the transit, which over here is in early Pisces, in this chart, it's right on near the IC point. And the IC point is a home point. In a chart like this, Aquarius is 4, and then Pisces takes on some of those qualities because the MC career, IC home. So Saturn is there, and of course it also heightens the Pluto in the locality because it's right next to the MC. But also very interesting, which you don't see nearly as clearly in this chart, is that the Moon in the locality chart is in the second house of money. And so the fallout, call it the punishment, call it the setback, Saturnian setback, is to the money house, which is indeed what it was. It was quite expensive to fix the problem. So this was a live illustration in my own chart. But now when we turn to the locies, we see some really interesting things happening. So first of all, you have the Pluto-Saturn square, which is basically a harsh energy of change, of some reconstruction, something that needs to be fixed, taken apart, etc. And Pluto in her chart rises, and that makes it immediately a body planet. By rises, I mean she's Leo rising. Pluto is in Leo, so it's a first sign planet rising, body energy, first sign, first house. And you see that as this event happened, the transiting Pluto, because Pluto starts here at birth, transiting Pluto is in the early degrees of Aquarius. And this is where I've said a number of times on the channel and probably in these classes as well, I've said often when Pluto is Pluto entering Aquarius has a lot more impact for people that have planets in early Aquarius, early Taurus, early Leo, and early Scorpio, because then it makes a dynamic angle to those points, and so then you get important things happening. And so there it is. The Pluto is in early Aquarius. Now, to be fair, it was already here before in 2023 a little bit, very briefly in the spring, and then earlier this year. It's been there already, but it didn't trigger this formation then. It triggered it now. As to why, you could say that's a little mysterious. This just goes more to the fact that when you're in a zone with a planet, because Pluto is going to be in these degrees, Pluto being a slow mover for 2 to 3 years, roaming around the degrees. But just so happened that now it got triggered. But you do get more information from the full moon, because notice that concurrent with this Pluto hit, you also see that the full moon happens at 23 plus, almost 24 degrees, Gemini to Sagittarius, which therefore makes a square to her Neptune in her chart. And the significance of this is that First of all, Neptune is in a health sign, so that's one pattern. Secondly, Neptune is co-ruler of the 8th, which is the place where you would get surgery, which is exactly what happened to her. She went and had emergency surgery, emergency repair surgery. Notice that the moon is in Sagittarius, which is the sign of the hip. And as it would also turn out, in this case, very interesting that her progressed chart, now that's a totally different way of measuring, but when you're doing progressions, you look at the days after birth, see where things are. You know, Nancy is now 84 years old, so this progressed moon has gone around the chart by progression, not quite 3 times, but approaching 3 turns, because the progressed moon takes 27 days, to go around. No, actually, so it has done 3 cycles. It hasn't done 3 new moons, but more than 3 cycles already. So, point being, though, that right now, the amazing astrological coincidence, which is what you've probably heard me say a number of times, that astrology is in a sense, the study of meaningful coincidence. So isn't it amazing to see it right at the same degrees of Sagittarius as this is happening? And so therefore, you've got the Pluto is the key, but then you've got the full moon acting as a major trigger to an important planet to add to that pattern, right? Now, separately, before I show you the locality, which gets downright spooky, notice the stations and how important they are, because you can see that in 2010 her progressed Venus was in its station at 70 days. Now the way these stations work, it has that flavor of horseshoes and grenades. In astrology, once you're in the vicinity of something, there is activation, meaningfulness, it's extra important. So in other words, rather than saying it only happens at 70, you would say something like 68 to 72 or even earlier. The point being that 2010, Nancy Pelosi, it's actually at 66. That was when she became leader of the House. In 2006, 2010 was, she actually lost the House then, as it turns out. But in this region, her prominence went way up. Now, 66 corresponds a little more with the Neptune station in her chart. The main point being that 2 important stations are happening in this vicinity, signaling that major events, major things are happening in her life. And, essentially from 66 to 2022. Was her career in the Senate as a leader. Not always the majority leader, only some of the time, but nevertheless, these become really important stations in her progressions, right? But now, if you turn to this being the natal chart where this happened, this event, you turn to where it happened, which is in Luxembourg. And what's really interesting is when you take a natal chart, if you move east, she's born in Baltimore, so you get across the Atlantic, you move east, this ascendant will progress in this direction. So middle of the Atlantic, Virgo, Libra, then by the time you get to Luxembourg in Europe, and by the way, this includes Germany. It's close enough to Germany that in Germany it's only a couple of degrees more down from where it is here. But in Luxembourg, where the event happens, notice that Scorpio rises, and notice that the Saturn and the Pluto, they go to the angles of the chart. Saturn right on the close to the descendant angle, the Pluto down at the bottom, squaring, and then the full moon, instead of cutting across these houses here, in 511 in this chart, in Luxembourg, it cuts across to 8, which are the surgery, the 8th is the surgery house. So would the progressed moon be there as well. So you get that effect in the Luxembourg chart. So this is where the locality will often show you something extra, something important about what just happened to a person. And the other thing that I noticed that is very interesting as well is the Antisha. You may recall from a prior class, Antisha is related to the idea that if you look at a natural zodiac, and if you think of a planet being at 1 degree Capricorn, the Antisha is on the other side of that in Sagittarius. And if it's 2 degrees Capricorn, it's 2 degrees in this direction. So 2 degrees Capricorn would be 28 Sagittarius, 3 Capricorn, 27. There's like a mirror image effect taking place from 0 Capricorn, 0 Cancer, but also 0 Aries, 0 Libra. they are the cardinal points. And the cardinal points are where things start. It's where the solstices and the equinoxes happen. And it turns out that knowing the antisha of your planets is quite important. It can be really important. I believe I showed you my own chart last week, and a point in my life when I was the sickest I've ever been. And the antishas degrees were being triggered in major ways. And notice that in Pelosi's chart, the antisha of her sun, which I put in here already, it's right there. It's at 23 degrees. So her antisha is right where her Neptune is. Now, this is significant in that the full moon is not just triggering the Neptune, it's triggering her antisha sun. So now you have her sun, which is her vital energy, as well as the ruler of the ascendant. You're adding a really important secondary factor that adds fuel to the fire, so to speak, and correlates with this in a really intense way. Okay, so I'll stop there, which, by the way, right now, the moon just entered Cancer. So now we'll go to the next topic, which is another theme in astrology that isn't covered a lot, but let's just say the more I do this, the more interesting, in fact, downright spooky it is, because of how incredibly reflective it is of events, situations, including world patterns. And this is what I think is most important in this case. So to explain how that works, it's the question of planets that are out of bounds. Now, when you're doing any chart and you're looking at planet positions, think of it as, like if you look at, for example, the USA chart, think of it as east-west. You're measuring where the planets are on that plane, and so this is called longitude. And the planets will be in whatever part of the sky, which you then assign a zodiac sign to, but they're in that part of the sky regardless, in the east-west alignment. But then you can do a thing where you look at north-south, and to do that, you correlate it with how far north and south the sun reaches. So the sun will reach its northernmost point around June 21st at the solstice, and that's when you have the peak of summer, the longest days. And conversely, in this direction, south would be winter, when the sun is as far south as it'll go. And of course, that's for the northern hemisphere. In the southern hemisphere, it's reversed. North is winter, south is summer. The point being that planets that are in whatever zodiac sign they are, that doesn't matter. But when they are in between those two, furthermost north, furthermost south, now those degrees are 23, 26, almost 23 and a half degrees north, 23 and a half south. Those planets in this region here, they're in bounds. They're inside the sun's south-north travel. But if they exceed those bounds, then they're said to be out of bounds. And here is a drawing of a full moon that happened, I think it's 2 or 3 years ago where I live, and you could see it at night, and you could see that it was well north of the sun's northernmost point. So therefore, it's out of bounds. Now, when planets are out of bounds, they acquire extra strength, extra prominence, and there's where, as always in astrology, you would say, well, what does that mean? Is it good? Is it bad? It's both, in the sense that you have something out of bounds, it's out of bounds. So for example, it's going to be more difficult in your younger years because you won't know what to do with it as much. There's not enough wisdom. You might make more mistakes. Like, for example, think of a planet like, well, take the moon. The moon out of bounds. The moon is, among many things, the moon rules a person's emotional flow, the flux of emotions. If you're younger and you have an out of bounds moon, already for any teenager, for example, the emotions tend to be like that. Now it's out of bounds, it's even more intense. It may lead you to doing things that are not in your best interest as a result. Or take a planet like Venus, which, for example, for a teenager might put them in maybe a promiscuous form of behavior, because Venus is the love nature. Or Mars, out of bounds, could be too much anger, since Mars is combative. On the other hand, if you look at the positive side of this, the moon would intensify the feelings, which could mean a greater sense of intuition, a greater sense of one's own emotional nature. The Venus could be something along the level of talents, having extra talent, maybe even extra good fortune because of the out of bounds nature. Mars, out of bounds, could turn out to be very athletic because it's very physical. So there are pluses and minuses, right? But now, when you're looking at whether planets, they're out of bounds situation, it's important to realize that in the current time right now, because this was different in the millennium from 0 to 1,000. From 0 to 1,000, pretty much all the planets could go out of bounds. But in the region we're in now, Jupiter, Saturn, and Neptune, strictly speaking, never get beyond 23, 26. They get close, which has meaning as well. And that's how I use them, so that if I see Jupiter or Saturn or Neptune, if I see them getting up close to the line, I consider that more prominent than not, basically. But these other planets here, Moon, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Uranus, Pluto, Eris, these definitely go out of bounds, and sometimes wildly out of bounds in the individual charts and in the world in general. So then we look at, all right, what can we make of this? Well, I've already mentioned the personal side. That's definitely true. Check to see if you have out-of-bounds planets. If they're out of bounds at birth, they become part of your character. It's like a definite character trait. I mean, remember that in a prior class, I mentioned that Einstein had the moon in Sagittarius out of bounds. And this is one of the patterns in his chart that enabled him to come up with this crazy theory, because it's really quite a brain leap that he pulled off, this guy. And Sagittarius, remember, is in the natural zodiac, Sagittarius, the Gemini-Sagittarius polarity, which, by the way, is what we're in now, although now the moon just went into Cancer, but this is where the full moon was, etc. So the Gemini is the micro-universe, and Sagittarius is the macro-universe. So you put quantum mechanics, the science of the molecular level, down here, and you put in here, you put the macro universe, the big universe, galaxies, time, space, continuum, all of that. That's what Einstein was an expert in. So having the moon in Sagittarius out of bounds enabled him to think outside the box and come up with this amazing theory. Now, of course, you could also look at other patterns in his chart, such as, for instance, that he was Cancer rising, so therefore the moon is extra strong, and then you might even bring in some of his personal behavior, might have been out of bounds in the more negative sense. This is with astrology, you get more than one pattern operating simultaneously from the perspective of being a famous individual, though the key thing here is that the moon in Sagittarius, in that case, becomes really, really positive. And this is where, from the vantage point of doing astrology proactively, don't focus too much on the downside of things. If there's a downside, then work to convert it to the upside. That's the bottom line. If you do that, your life will improve. And this is where you look at any chart, including, for instance, we were talking about Pelosi. If you say Saturn Pluto isn't fortunate, well, it certainly wasn't fortunate here, but other than that, her life has been quite fortunate. She's managed to do quite well with the Saturn Pluto energy, because Saturn Pluto, if you can harness it, is really powerful stuff, particularly for a person that is trying to change situations, in the world, literally, because that's what Pluto, Saturn squares, oppositions, conjunctions are. And so then she becomes a vehicle for that. And so overall, there's no problem. It's actually a huge asset. Yeah, Mary's asking if the nodes can be considered out of bounds. I'm not totally sure about that. I gotta look that up. I know the black moon goes out of bounds, but I don't recall right now if the nodes themselves go out of bounds. It's possible. I'll take that as a question for next week. But definitely the black moon does. The black moon. And so there, for example, if you look at a black moon out of bounds, you would say that the shadowy, potentially shameful, dark place in the psyche is extra strong. But again, with two sides to that, because an out of bounds black moon, if properly integrated, might even be more powerful in terms of empowering the personality. But now, returning to this, here's what is really interesting. You'll recall that, and by the way, before I say that, remember I said the moon goes out of bounds, wildly so, but the moon does this pattern, unlike the planets themselves. The planetary out of bounds pattern is a little less predictable. With the moon, it does this thing where it's out of bounds for 9 years, and then it's in bounds for 9 years. So the people that are born, for example, between about 83 and 92 have out of bounds moon, either on the north side or the south side, and then it skips 9 years, and then it resumes. So we just entered in 2020. We're in a period where the moon now is going in and out of bounds. And not that I always track this, but it is important. But what I mean by that is when I'm looking at something happening, an event, whatever, But I would definitely think it's a good idea to track it more during the decade we're in because of the fact that it's out of bounds, which it wasn't in most of the, 2011 to about 2020, although in here in the 2000s it was. So that's the way the moon works. But now turning to what I wanted to bring up today, which relates to, if you recall, last week we were exploring this whole thing about how in the 1860s the USA enters a civil war situation, and the most obvious in terms of relating it to today's patterns is the Neptune position, which in 2025 goes in here in early Aries and then continues 2026 and so on. It matches the Civil War period. And the Uranus likewise, although now it's a little different because in the modern era, the return of Uranus, which happened for the US right on the start of the war, is going to happen later in the cycle, which I think is better than putting them together like that, where Neptune is creating pressure to these early Cancer planets from Aries with the Uranus return simultaneously. It's my sense is it's better to have them separate. Because in the modern era, that's what's happening, right? Neptune goes in first and Uranus catches up later. And so we were grappling with the idea, well, what is this going to mean? And exploring, well, why did it just happen that, assuming nothing changes, I know that there are people hoping that there will be some kind of change so that Trump never gets inaugurated, although I think I've mentioned that from my vantage point, that's very unlikely to happen, and it's more likely that he will be, or that the GOP, at least in the form of, I presume, J.D. Vance, which is crazy to think, but that's the world we're in at the moment, is inaugurated. And if not, great. I mean, I'd be deliriously happy to see what some people are hoping for around the election being completely overturned and handed over to the Democrats. So, but you've got, this is the Civil War. Now, if we look at out-of-bounds patterns, and the point being, you want to know what was out of bounds when, and what did it mean. And so here, this is not an out-of-bounds pattern. This is just longitude transits, right, and to the U.S. chart. But what is really fascinating, and this is coming to the foreground now as a result of a woman who's publishing a book on the topic. I don't have her name handy, but I'll bring that up next week if you're interested in buying her book on the topic. But essentially she's talking about the out of bounds Pluto situation. And the reason that's important is, well, let's look first, before we go there, let's look at the pattern of Pluto, the declination is what it's called. It's latitude declination. That's what out of bounds means. And if we look to the 1940s, what you notice, and here the red line is the declination of Pluto, and these black horizontal lines are they show you the demarcation points. I'm not showing it at the bottom here, it's just at the top, so the north position. And you can see that Pluto had not been in bounds in the earlier part of the century, but it reaches the line in the 1937 range, and it's then essentially out of bounds until the mid-1950s. And you can see that this is when the Nazi regime rose to prominence. It rose to prominence in the earlier part of the 1930s. There you can talk about how the planet is moving in that direction. You don't have to wait for the exact hit, but on the other hand, you can also say yes, and when it got there, things got really dicey because it was by 1939 essentially when the war starts. Hitler starts invading everything and everyone, and then this whole period is really violent, really difficult. And indeed, it was in 1945 is when the war ends, right? Now, I think this graphic shows it a little more clearly here. Yes, okay, so now you see it in big. Already by 36, 37, it's getting out of bounds, the Pluto. And then this red circle is the period of the war, solidly out of bounds. But you notice that, this is when the bomb was dropped, by the way. This essentially ended the war. But notice that the Uranus out of bounds pattern, Uranus reaches pretty much, this line is, this is where you, again, horseshoes and grenades. the Uranus is practically there as the war is ending. And now then it continues, though. Uranus continues to be out of bounds, definitely in the late 40s and into the early 50s. Now, my perspective on this has always been that Pluto is pretty clearly a fascist planet. It's the lord of the underworld, but it's also the idea of ultra-masculinity, domination, fascism. And almost always is going to be in the form of a male or a female with a very strong Pluto, which there are lots of females with strong Plutos, but, well, I suppose in the future it's possible that we'll see a female Hitler or a female Trump. But from my perspective, that's probably an unusual pattern, so it's more likely to be a male thing. Uranus, I don't know that I would tag it as male or female. Uranus, though, to my mind, is the most connected to democracy and the rule of the collective, whereby the collective rules, but also the individual is greatly enhanced. And Uranus is a very independent energy in the psychological realm, so that makes a lot of sense. And so Aquarius becomes a place where the individual has power, but the collective overall controls the situation. And you can see that, first of all, it was discovered in 1782 or 3, I believe, which is really quite concurrent with the founding of the US, and as well as not too far away from there, the discovery of electricity, which separately has liberated humanity in a major way, even if you argue against it for other reasons. But all I can tell you is lose your power like we did a few weeks ago, and you realize how power dependent we are. So Uranus is a major liberator and very antithetical to the fascist cause from my vantage point. I know that there are astrologers that will present paradigms against this, such as, for example, you could tie Uranus as well through its connection to Aquarius and to technology, electricity, etc., to corporations, because corporations are groups of people, so you could do that. But I think fundamentally, Uranus, more than anything else, is the democratic planet par excellence. And notice that it's very active in the late 40s and into the early 50s, which was a period when democracy, at least in Europe and in most of Europe, not east of Germany, although you could argue that was the big clash to that. The Soviet Union through the Pluto is in here as well. But the Uranus is very strong. And in fact, this whole map too, if you look at, turning to Pluto for a second again, Pluto does not start to go inbounds until the mid-50s. And this period in America was the McCarthy period, when there was, the communist scare and the intense competition with the Soviet Union. And that didn't really end until the mid-50s. McCarthy then was shunned. He went from being hugely important, and I believe it was between 48 and 54 was his period. But he died in 57. He was an alcoholic. He died in disgrace. And here, though, he was having a lot of influence, which to my mind is the channeling of Pluto, because he was doing a Pluto trip on Americans, basically. But the overall collective resisted. Nothing came of it eventually. And then the Pluto goes in bounds, and so does the Uranus. But in here, my feeling is that Uranus really helped to save the day in terms of the competition with Pluto. And you can see it here. This is drawn now with numbers. By the mid-1930s, Pluto is gaining, it's out of bounds. It's really out of bounds during the war as well. Then the Uranus catches up to it and neutralizes it, right? So now, here's the thing. That's for the 1940s, and I think it's pretty graphic. To me, this feels like a very good reflection of what was going on. You can then bring in other things in the transits, like Pluto was in early Leo during this period, had been in Cancer. I've often said that Cancer, Capricorn are signs that are more likely to go fascist, because Capricorn being the sign of government and Cancer being the home and the homeland, you get that clash. So that's valid, and certainly it was there in the 1930s. The war is fought, though, primarily with Pluto and Leo, which is the opposite to Aquarius, the other sign. But it didn't last long. By here, the mid-40s, it had radically changed. So now, when we look at the current situation in the current time, we have this map where now what's happening is Uranus and Pluto once again are doing out-of-bounds activity, and this may be the best explanation for the not just the US tilt toward this kind of thinking through the election of someone like Trump. And by the way, you can argue that even though it's in the out of bounds entry isn't until, strictly speaking, is October of 25, but it's close. This is, again, horseshoes and grenades. Going back, you could even go back to 2016. It's going in that direction. It's pulling things in that direction. But the point being, though, that right now, it's not just the US, it's also lots of other places. And most people think that this has to do with the immigration displacement. Some people even tie it to the climate change patterns which lead to that kind of thing, etc. Nevertheless, there it is, right? The Pluto is really active between the mid-25 period all the way into the middle of the next decade. However, notice that Uranus begins to go, it goes out of bounds in 2031, but if you look at the behavior here back in this period, it didn't need to reach the actual point. I mean, there the war ends, but you can argue that even here, moving in the direction of going out of bounds would act as a check to this particular pattern, which is indeed what happened. And when you look at this, you see that, yes, it doesn't happen till 31, but before that, in here, it's very likely to have an effect. So maybe the line could be something like that, and then you make this more intense because it's actually when it's actually out of bounds. So now, if you then are projecting, you'd say, well, yes, right now we're dealing with pretty pronounced ultra-masculine, potentially fascistic energy. The dictators of the world are doing better. This is true in here in the US, at least the way we're expecting it to go. It's the same for Russia, presumably, though it starts to get a little bit, you can see that it's not totally clear because, for instance, the al-Assad situation in Syria, that's a blow to the dictators, and by rebound, it's affected Putin very negatively because and also the Ayatollahs in Iran, and there you've got Israel, which is a democracy, probably being the agent of that particular pattern through the way they've conducted the war. So it's not totally clear that it's moving in that direction in a massive way, but nevertheless, I mean, the Pluto is there, so there's no question. This is not just US, it is a worldwide virus of sorts, but also you've got the Uranus in a definite offset happening at the same time. And notice, to gauge, well, is there an example of the way Uranus works? Notice, I think it's fascinating to see that Uranus did its previous out of bounds down here. It wasn't quite, but I would definitely count it. It's like having a station of a planet close to the line. The late 80s. Now, what happened then? That was the period when the Soviet Union fell apart and the world, the democratic impulse in the world, got this huge boost. Separately, you could argue that this was also when the internet was essentially being born. Didn't quite click until the mid-90s, but this region of Uranus, the internet is Uranian as well. Notice the internet as the linking of people through the wires, through electricity, which is what Uranus is, technology and so forth, but also a strong democratic correlation at the time. So I see this planet as super helpful, and just so it shows up here to check the Pluto. But on the other hand, I will admit that in the immediate pattern that we're in here, in France and all kinds of places, in Germany, and in fact, even I mentioned Israel, but that democracy is in quite a struggle as well. I mean, democracies everywhere are challenged, but I much prefer this, having an actual competition, between two planets where Uranus can get in there and counter the pattern of the Pluto being where it is. Now, something I'll tell you is that this woman says in her presentation, which I haven't watched, but someone summarized it for me. I'll take a peek at it soon. Pluto has been out of bounds in earlier this century for sure. In fact, I can vouch for it in that I've done many charts of people in consultation. People born in the 30s and 40s and into the early 50s have the Pluto in their personal chart out of bounds. In fact, Pelosi's is close to out of bounds, but this is the thing again, is that you always have to calibrate charts to see how it's showing up and where, for example, I'll give you an example of a person with an out of bounds Pluto, two people actually. One would be Trump, because he has Pluto out of bounds, and he clearly tilts to the fascist side. He loves dictators, wants to be a dictator. And then there's Steve Bannon, who's another Plutonian character, and that's how they're manifesting their Pluto. Pelosi has a very strong Pluto as well, but she doesn't express it in that way. So it's sort of like the idea of exploring something, and you may find out that, excuse me, you may find out that you've got Bannon and Trump on this end of it, and then you discover someone who is a great psychotherapist, for example, because you can do Plutonian explorations and transformations of the psyche through Pluto, and it has nothing to do with being a fascist. So it's the way the planet is expressed, right? So yes, here's a list that I found on how the planets in the 1 to 1000, they were all going out of bounds, including Jupiter, for example. You can see it there, going as far out of bounds as 24 degrees, and Saturn crossing through the 23-degree range, but now they don't. Saturn doesn't quite get there. Jupiter does, but not in recent years. So that's why I was telling you what I do now is, with Jupiter, Saturn, and Neptune, I just see if they are near the edge. This, by the way, is something that Stephen Forrest, the astrology, corroborates, where he says don't be too rigid in assigning meaning, so that, for example, if someone has Jupiter at 23 degrees or 22 plus, that makes it a more prominent Jupiter. It's going to add an effect to it similar to when, for example, Jupiter is in a station when a person is born. So it's changing. But now Pluto will not be out of bounds, according to what this, and I'll take her word for it, what this woman is saying, for thousands of years. It turns out that the way its orbit is, you can map it way ahead, and so we're dealing with the last out-of-bounds Pluto activity. Now, there, once again, I want to see what she says, but I noticed that astrologers, by and large, I don't know if the word is pessimistic, maybe it's sensationalistic. They're always, or not always, frequently, they try to scare people. Oh, look at this, it's going to be doom, gloom, and doom. In fact, I heard a presentation by a really intelligent astrologer on the American Uranus return, and it was really quite gloom and doom, when in fact there are lots of positives to be taken away from Uranian activity and the way it ultimately frees people and is very antithetical and even hostile to plutocratic, Plutonian forms of governance and rulership and so on. So to me, that would be good news. I would think it's better if Pluto is not out of bounds, where pretty clearly in the so-called meaningful coincidence that you see the 1940s featuring the Plutonian trip, and then we get these conditions, and now here we are again facing down something. Well, let's hope it isn't similar, because 1940s were horrific, but at least we know what the correlation is, and we know that there's the offset as well. So let me see. I think that's all I have for today in terms of the yes. So go ahead if you want to ask any questions, comments. Unmute yourself and.
Andre, I have a question. So I'm looking at this chart that you've put up. The vertical line between the 1980 and 1990. That's an out of bound period as well.
You mean in here? You're talking about in here? Is that
between? Up at the top, you have the 1980, 90s, 2000, 210, 220.
Yes. Okay.
That vertical black line between the 1980 and 1990, that's demonstrating an out-of-bound period as well.
This line here, yes. So this line here.
I don't see that you're pointing to anything, but...
Okay. Do you see the pointer? Do you see the...
No, I don't see the pointer.
Okay, well, you see the line that goes... This line here. Do you see that line? Okay, let me just... Hold on. Let me make this line a lot thicker so that we're... Okay, that line, right?
Yes, that's the one I'm speaking of, yes.
Okay, that line is basically 1989. If I stretch it all the way up here, that's the peak. But you can see that before that and after that, the Uranus is really close to this line, the one at the bottom. The one at the bottom is the out-of-bounds line. So let me make that one thicker so you can see it.
Oh, I see.
Okay, so let's make this one, let's make it red. The out-of-bounds line will be red. Okay, so that's out of bounds. The Uranus there, so this yellow thing is showing Uranus close to that line. So Uranus becomes stronger during that period. Over here, these two lines in the 2020s, that's the entire period where Uranus is active, and then, the Pluto. This is Pluto here, down here, and Uranus up here.
That's right.
Right? So that's how that works. Is that clear now?
Yes, it is. Thank you.
Yeah. So that's where, this is another thing that solar fire does, where you can draw these lines as waves, but you can also do it by running an ephemeris, telling the program to give you the declinations instead of the degrees of the zodiac. So it'll tell you. And you can, that's something I have to do, which I haven't done, and I need to do it, is run an ephemeris for the 20th century and for the 21st century with declinations, so you can see always where the planets are. Because remember, I was saying how right now, in the period we're in, the moon goes in and out of bounds frequently. And it's just another pattern. Astrology is like that. You track full moons, you track all kinds of things, but out of bounds is important. You know, no question. It gives you really good information.
Fascinating. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, no, I mean, absolutely. It's this year, when I saw it yesterday, I thought gulp at first, and then I thought, oh, well, hold on a second, there's something good here too, which, I'm going to see now in her presentation that she addressed the Uranus, because the Uranus, first of all, realize something about this too. Yes, in astrology, obviously, small bodies like Pluto, which Pluto is smaller than the moon, so, and it's way out there in the boonies, but I tilt to the fact that in the end, the solar system, which is what we are, you know how people say we are made of stardust. That's true. All our molecular structure, the elements in us, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, all those things are created by stars, right? But it's not a big leap to then, okay, we're created that way. We're stardust. But also, if a chart, any chart you look at, is like for Pelosi, right? She's at the center and of the chart, because the astrology is geocentric. You're in the center. These forces are around you. It's not a big leap to say we are stardust. We're also planetary dust, meaning we were created from the material in this solar system, not in some other solar system. The same matter that creates, you could say the sun creates the planets, for example. The sun is the original pattern, and then you get these other planets. They're all linked in that way, and just so we are a product of that. Now, where this can become a little tricky is people say, well, yeah, but the planets are out there and I'm here. No, you have to look at them as the planets are in you. They're both out there. It's almost like an illusion that they're out there. They're out there, but they're also in you. They are your literal makeup, both in the way they are astrologically, but also like organically as what composes you. And when you do that, you have to realize that, remember this graphic that I had shown where the relative sizes are such that it's almost all sun. So all of us are mostly sun, then Jupiter, Saturn, then Uranus, Neptune. Once you get to here, well, really, once you get to the sun is huge, 99.86%. But then Jupiter, Saturn take up most of the rest. And of the last penny, Uranus and Neptune. These here are almost nothing. They're very, very tiny, including Pluto. So I'm just going to say, make a blanket, Uranus and Neptune are way more powerful than Pluto. So Uranus can definitely counter Pluto in its effect. Definitely. It's a major, major influence in the solar system by size. Not to mention that if you follow the mythology, Uranus is said to be the lord of the sky. Uranus gave birth to Saturn, which gave birth to Jupiter. Uranus is in that mythology, it's the most powerful planet, literally. Do you have a question, Mary?
Yeah, so looking at Nancy's chart, I'm going beyond here. So looking at Nancy's chart, she has all that stellium right off of her left brain.
Off of her what?
Her left brain.
Left, here? Oh, yeah, no, well, okay.
All the stellium of all those planets on her mind, and...
Well, no, okay, well, that the reason you're saying that is because, okay, so what do you mean? If I go like that, then what do you say? Okay, that's because you're looking at her head.
In the medical astrology, also, Aries is relative to the head.
Yes, that's true. It's that the head and then Taurus the throat. Yes.
Yes.
I don't know though that you should necessarily. I mean, you can do that. You can say that makes it more mind, but there are plenty of Aries that are not cerebral at all. Just like, look at Einstein. He was Pisces, which is the sign of the feet, and he had the moon in Sagittarius, and he was a total brainiac. So be careful with how far you take associations. There may be connections like that, but I don't know that I would make as big a deal out of that. I would make a bigger deal out of the fact that she is a lot of 9th sign, 10th sign concentration, and the 10th is career. The 9th is already a career place in the chart because it's where you're publishing information and influencing the world through information and teaching and all that kind of stuff. So that's really strong in her chart. And someone like this is going to be very keen to be out there in the world and influencing things. That's how I would look at it. And then even more important is look at when she's having cycles to all of these things, to see what was happening. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, this one too, to give you an example, you see, she's the same, in fact, even close to the same degree, Leo rising, like Trump, and like someone like JD, also that complete idiot, Rudy Giuliani. And you see how just because you have, yes, having it there, this is where Regulus is, that fixed star, these degrees tend to be important, but she's not doing the same trip, including the Pluto rising, so it's a very different expression of the Leo rising. Now, it is, all of them have that Leo rising confidence, it's true, but my sense of her is it's a lot more benign. Now, another thing too that's interesting about Pelosi is she has Eris conjunct the sun, and she's definitely an expression of that warrioress, female energy, female power, literally, having sun conjunct Eris like that. So, any other comments? Anything else you want to add or ask about? By the way, one thing could be if you want to make any comments about something that you want me to take up in future classes that you've been wondering about, if there's anything like that, feel free to bring it up as well. Because one thing is that I've been delaying something. It's always happens with astrology though. Each week, what'll happen is I'll have a certain plan about what I'm going to do, but then an event like this caught me by surprise yesterday, the Pelosi thing. I went to look and I saw the pattern right away, and I thought it was quite fascinating. And the other thing with the out of bounds, which I think is super relevant to the current political situation, this also was something that I learned about on Saturday. So then I realized that it would be something important to present. I intend to talk about it on the channel as well because people are understandably very nervous, but I think there's at least some room for optimism on this level. But the reason I said all that is that I've been delaying going to the basics of describing the planetary energies and their connection to the signs, because the two illuminate each other really well, and you get a lot of information and a lot of clarity, and it's one of the most important things to do, even if I repeat it and I've done it in a few classes over the years, but it's really, really important. Yes, the question, Mary?
Well, looking at slide, let's see, 17, there was a couple before it, 15, slide 15. There's another line. There's like another trajectory of a line.
Where are you talking now about?
Well, we were looking at slide 17.
17, this one?
Yes.
Okay.
But there was one other, it's slide 13.
Slide 13.
Slide 13.
Oh, this one here?
What's that bottom line that's like
direct?
That's
Eris.
That's
but
Eris.
Eris is not Eris. The reason I put it in, it's distracting here, but Eris is a fascinating one in that Eris, what it does is there are periods when it goes wildly out of bounds, and what is really interesting about that, and I'm talking, here, out of bounds is 23 and a half. Eris will go to 50 plus, like way out of bounds, right? Way. And what is interesting, and this is where, you look at a chart like this and you think, all right, so what do we got? We got Pluto, we got Eris is way out of bounds for the U.S., right? That has meaning as well, because Eris in the U.S., first of all, it complicates the chart quite a bit because Eris opposes Venus, Jupiter, Sun. But I think the force of this planet is unstoppable, in terms of eventually elevating female power to its proper place because of the out-of-bounds nature of it. And probably it would already have done it if it were out of bounds now, which it's not. But I believe, if I'm not mistaken, I'll take this up in a future class, I'm pretty sure that it might have been out of bounds when women first got the vote, for example, in 1920s, I think. Thing you have to keep in mind that a lot of these movements, you're fighting cultural trends, and, the way we think today is far more evolved than it was 100 years ago, but that's how things work. They often move forward more incrementally than in some kind of revolutionary way. It usually starts there. In fact, the pattern that I became aware of is that women were first given the vote in the 1920s, but they only started voting for themselves in the 1980s, which corresponds to they started to vote more democratically than men. And it's why, by and large, I think this is the second time only in the last 40 years that the Republican Party won the popular vote as a result of that.
And now that the patriarchy and the oligarchy, they're talking about taking away the women's vote again.
Well, they are. They're talking a lot, but talking and actualizing are two different things. I continue to say that based on this pattern, the Uranus is going to resist the this kind of idea. They're going to try for sure because that's their nature. It's true, and this is the thing too, that patterns don't die easily. It's the way it is. You get resistance to a new thing, and this is Pluto's. Well, especially if you say, "Hey, this is the last time it's going to be out of bounds in thousands of years." So there's that, to consider. But certainly, even in the near term, Uranus is gaining on it. It's moving up there to contest, just like it did in here, where it had a lot of influence. So this is why I said in the last class, if you recall, that there's an argument to be made that it's better. Well, or at least it's explained and it gives a good framework for the 2028 election, where Uranus returning is a good thing, both from the perspective of what Uranus represents, but also, the freedom patterns, but also just the fact that right now there's a lot of division. So this lurching back and forth change is more likely to be from where it is than from, than keeping the status quo. Uranus is notorious for going the other way. So therefore it puts the authoritarian impulse at great risk a few years from now. And why is that? Because people will see what they're doing. And there's one thing that people forget about this crew. They're not the sharpest pencils in the drawer. They just aren't. They're not. And the other thing that I think you'll see with these people is that, because, Trump is talking about tariffs and this and that. They're just out to make money. They're very greedy, oligarchic. My feeling is what you're going to see is a lot of corruption, a lot of manipulation a lot of stealing from the treasury, which is not usually a great thing when you, both in the sense that it isn't and in the sense that when the voting public sees that, they tend to get very upset. Corruption is one of the best ways or easiest ways to take down a regime in the democratic world, right? So that, and then the incompetence, which means they're not super sharp, they're not really interested in governance. So then they will, people will see it for what it is. And that's, reason to be somewhat optimistic. Any other comments anyone wants to make? All right, well, I guess we can stop there. And let's see if by next week I'll finally be doing this thing with the signs and the planets. All right, have a good rest of Sunday, everyone.